Giving Week. For 135 years, MBA has been the health and social service ministry of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. And this week, the MBA is raising funds to help our initiatives and our programs like this one, not just to survive, but to thrive. And so we join us in celebrating this inaugural week by making a gift at mbacares.org/giving week. So a couple of quick housekeeping things. If you're unfamiliar with our format, we've shifted a little bit this year, and you have each received a handful of workshops that have been pre-recorded. We invite you to watch those at the beginning of each week so that when Thursday comes each week, we will have a live Q&A and Keynote session via Zoom, which is what we're doing right now. And so each week you'll have the opportunity to engage the presenters whose videos you have viewed earlier that week. And we want to invite you for the remainder of this evening as questions arise, as thoughts pop up, we invite you to utilize the chat function and to post your questions there so that we can begin this engagement in this time of just learning alongside each other. Each week we'll have a different theme, and this week's theme is Imagine a World. And I love what Darnell said earlier, a world that works for all of us. We look around and we see the ways that disparity and oppression wreak havoc, and that we hear the cries of God's people. And so we want to imagine a new world and explore the ways that we can respond. And so today for our keynote, we are deeply grateful, honored, and just very joyful to learn from and to be inspired by Reverend Dr. William Barber II.
He's coming back for you and me one day. That's the love, that's the love, that's the love, that's the love, that's the love. Well, they hung my Savior high, stretched him wide. He hung his head for me to die. That's the love, that's the love, that's the love.
Green has taught me what church is and what church is supposed to be.
It is a prophetic ministry meant by Jesus Christ to help all people.
I was raised in this church.
It's one of the most welcoming, loving, caring, and compassionate churches that I've ever been a part of.
This church has grown throughout the years, has always served the public, always done great things for the community.
I love being a part of a place that's doing something beyond the walls.
For the people in our community.
No matter what race, creed, color.
It's a loving church, and no matter how much trouble you're in, they are here to help you.
Because when you go to a church and the church only cares about your soul, that's called Gnosticism. It's an ancient heretical form of Christian faith that says you don't matter, just your soul, what's inside you. And that's the same hypocritical faith that was taught by the slave masters to the slave. We want to baptize you so your soul will go to heaven. But you can't use your baptism to get your hind parts out of slavery. And I don't know that Jesus.
Though the decades march on, the dream lives.
We are here, assembled for hope.
Courage and commitment, continued by torchbearers like Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, building up the Goldsboro community.
They're located here on this corner, but they reach so much further than that.
It's dealing with the community as a whole. It's not excluding anybody.
We are about those that have less than, that are disenfranchised, that have no hope. And coming here, we have a pastor, a shepherd, the angel of this house, who gives us the word of God, and we live it out.
Reverend Dr. Barber is the chairperson of the Rebuilding Broken Places Community Development Corporation. The facility provides on-site job training, childcare and meals for children, and tutoring. The corporation also offers home buying workshops and families.
Forward together!
You'll often find Greenleaf at the state capitol in Raleigh.
We are not a in the Four Walls Church. We are in the community church
that works to advance social justice in North Carolina.
Hello, Ms. Barbara. We think it's time for legislators to stop being ideologues, Republicans, Democrats. Think about these people.
I love the teachings of my pastor. I love our Moral Monday.
The Moral Monday events demonstrate a classic David versus Goliath struggle. The Reverend taking on a right-leaning state legislature that has introduced an avalanche of extreme policies that hurt students, the poor, and the sick.
There's something inside so strong. The more you refuse to hear my voice.
I love Greenleaf mostly because Reverend Barber preaches the Word of God.
The role of the ark was to protect. The role of Jesus, come unto me, all you'd have let, was to protect. And the role of the church, the power of being the church, is to be not only a church that preaches good news, but protects people with good deeds. By this love, all persons will know that you are God's disciples.
Greenleaf loves you for who you are. They see you through God's eyes.
I've raised 2 children here, and I just feel at home when I'm here.
It is about giving, but it's also about learning the true definition of what Christ's purpose in this world was about.
The Lord saved me, but through coming to Greenleaf and listening to the God within my pastor and God within my members, I have a defined mission. I know what I am to do with my salvation. Besides just sit there and fast and go to church and Sunday school, I know how to accomplish my assignments.
It is a church that loves everybody, a church that welcomes everybody, because we serve a God that's a God of everybody.
And I'm just glad to be a part of a place that is so loving and welcoming.
This is a good place to raise your children, get foundation in the Word.
We indeed are living out, being concerned about the total man. Just not about the soul and trying to ensure that they get to heaven, but to ensure that they enjoy part of heaven while we're here on this earth.
Thank God for Jesus and being a member of a church that cares about God's people. We love you and we thank you.
Well, I'm so thankful to be here with you today. I sit here and look at Traci Blackmon. She came down there and preached me and made me stay 5 more years. Some years ago, she came and did a pastor's appreciation. I was told today to stop saying that I'm old, but I have been pastoring now 30 years in one congregation. I don't know what that makes you in the UCC and the Disciples Church. Total 34, started my licensed ministry in 1984. On my father's birthday, I preached my trial sermon. I don't know if y'all remember back when they used to have trial sermons. And everybody sat there and looked at you. And that was in 84. So what's that, almost 50 years? What is that? Almost, I don't know what it is, 40 years ago. And I'm just thankful. I also want you to know that Greenleaf Christian Church was a congregation born under a brush shelter in the 1800s, right after slavery. They literally, in the area we now, they pulled the brushes down and started a congregation. We started a congregation in Wayne County, which was one of the most racist counties in North Carolina, one of the last counties to even attempt to desegregate. Not far from our church, about a mile from our church, there was a gathering in 1896 when Charles B. Aycock, who would later become governor of North Carolina, preached a sermon in a place called Eureka, of all places, Eureka. And the imagination that he spurred in the people was so dark that they said by the time he finished speaking and lying and taking scripture out of context to justify segregation, that 1,000 white men were barking like dogs and slobbering at their mouths. And 2 years later, because of that, he went around the country, the state doing that. the Wilmington riots of 1898, November 10th, 1898, the insurrection then, where over 3% of Wilmington was killed. Wilmington was 50% Black. The wealthiest people in Black people and people in the state were in Wilmington's closest port to Africa and Europe in the continental United States. On November the 10th, all of that was undone by the red shirts and a Gatling gun. But it started through immoral teaching and imagination, ugly imagination. Their mantra then was, we must take our state back and make it great again, literally. Those riots were born in the church. We called it a massacre. And for some 50 years, we didn't even talk about it in our history books in North Carolina. I come from the county where right across the street from Greenlee Christian Church, the Ku Klux Klan met regularly. The people of that church early in their lives had to walk past the Klan meeting house in order to go in to worship. The first pastor of that church was C.R.D. Whitfield. That was his original name because he was born, his family was born in slavery. But in the 1800s, when he became the pastor of the church, like me, he walked on a cane for more than 50 years of his life. He lived in the 80s. He was a shorter man than I am. He had 7 sons. All of them became preachers. He was a bishop. At one time, one of his sons was pastor at Loudon Avenue Christian Church in Roanoke, Virginia. But he walked from Wolfsboro to Raleigh, to the North Carolina legislature to demand a name other than the slave name he had inherited. And the name he chose was C.R.D. Whitfield. He imagined the church having its own printing press so they could print not only Sunday school materials, but other things. He imagined the church having its own school. And back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, started getting nickels and dimes from people in order to create what was called the Goldsboro Institute, which was to become a college for Black people, because Atlantic Christian, now Barton College, wouldn't accept Black people and brown people, and hardly accepted women. That's the church that I pastor. I've been there now since 1993. And since that time, we started working with the National Benevolent Association in 1999. And with Board of Church Extension, we took the church off for a 2-day in the mountains, no TV, anything, imagining. And we asked the question, what kind of community are we really in? We did an analysis of 3 miles around the congregation, with the congregation in the center. We got all the data on that. And then after we looked at the data, poverty, women, men, children, crime, every aspect, we said, what should we be doing? Why do we exist on the corner of William Street and Patetown Road? And we said, if we couldn't answer that, then there was no need for us to exist, because what we said was, when we read the scriptures, that every miracle that Jesus did, he did it on the road. In other words, he did it as he met it. If he spit on somebody or took his hands and healed them, it was all based on he met it, he encountered it in his space. So what were we encountering in our space? And out of that, we came away with a 7-point vision. I won't go through it all. I'd love to share it with you and other congregations. And we decided one of the things we had to do at that time, and those of you that have been pastor will understand how crazy this was. We had no debt. The first 3 years that I was there, we paid off everything. So we had no debt by 1997. We came out of this gathering saying that we had to go in debt, but we had to go in debt to invest in the community, something the church had not done. They had done it by building a sanctuary, but they had not thought about the level of money we were talking about to do ministry, right? To do something that wouldn't immediately be tangible, like a pew or a Sunday school classroom. And so we identified that we had to first possess the land, because the land to our left was owned by a man who said he would never sell it, and I'm just gonna be honest, to niggers. I mean, he told us that as late as the 1998. Across the street, they were thinking about taking an old abandoned grocery store and turning it into a nudie bar. And we had an opportunity to buy that property, but we did not have the money that we needed. So we went to the Board of Church Extension with this vision. And they first said, "You want to do what? And you're not going to build a sanctuary?" No. And the place you're purchasing is going to have to be refurbished. Yes. And we said, but we need to possess the land. That part of, in order to imagine the future, we need to possess the land before the future came into existence. We had to have the land first. And they said, well, what is it going to be? And we said, it's going to be about $800,000 they wanted for this piece of land. And they asked us, said, well, you all need to put down about $50,000. Well, I don't know if I should have told them. I didn't tell them at the time, but that's all we had in the bank. And so when we did our down payment of $50,000, we had no money at Greenleaf for about 8 months, except what came in on Sunday. You talk about taking a step of faith. And then it required us to carry a debt of about $7,000 a month. And then we ended up getting another piece of property. I won't go through all the details, but long and short, we ended up purchasing the land. But then we couldn't refurbish the building because we needed about another $300,000. But I have been involved in community development work, and one thing I knew is that if you invest in community, that investing invites. So when we purchased the land, others started coming, what do y'all want to do with this? How can we help? So that money invited other money. So we were able to get a $250,000 grant to refurbish the building for a preschool and a job training center and a cultural center and so forth and so on. Then a grant opportunity came open at NBA. And the first 2 times that we had applied, we didn't get it because we didn't have like land to put in the grant. But this time we could say in the grant that we had all the land necessary and that the church would give that land to the 202, what is it, 202? It was the federal grant for senior citizen housing. And so we got that we won that. And then the floods came through Wayne County, the one that hit New Orleans a long time ago, had people in the Superdome, where the residual of that came through North Carolina, hit us bad. And we were the only community development corporation in the city at that time. We had developed a community development corporation with a commitment to build low-income homes for low-income, single-family homes. So it's almost like we bought the land and didn't know how we were going to finish, used all our money, and then everything started coming. It was almost like God said, I'm not going to tell you how I'm going to do it. You just go that way. Kind of like he told Moses. Moses said, well, how would I know you with me? He said, when you go that way, and then you end back up on this mountain free. That's how you'll know I'm with you. But you're not going to know I'm with you until you go that way. And so the long story short of it is we took $1.5 million of initial investment, the $50,000 from the church that we didn't have. And it has produced now $14 million of development within a 3-mile radius, all that grew out of church. 60 homes now that we've done, 60 single family homes that people who were renting and otherwise may have never owned their own home. Some were paying more in public housing renting than they now pay for their own home. 41 units to senior citizen units, a 5-star preschool, a job training program, a cafeteria that is now open, a restaurant community that we also moving now toward culinary arts for formerly incarcerated persons, computer training that we do out of there for senior citizens and others, an after-school program that's been acknowledged by Harvard and MIT. We had a Willing to Touch, which actually was an HIV/AIDS testing center. That's a whole nother story of how we got there. We have a community garden there that people come, and anybody who's hungry can come. Senior citizen, all this managed, and now we're getting ready to build greenhouses there. We own the other land, the land that the guy said he wouldn't sell. He died, and we didn't kill him. He just died. Of course, now the mothers did go on that property, Tracy, and prayed for 3 months straight every Monday and said it was theirs, and they would pour a little oil out. I did not tell the women to do that. They did that on their own. And his sons ended up going to bankruptcy, and they need to get rid of the land. So we own it. And one of the things we're looking at now is how we can use that to maybe bring a grocery store, particularly designed for our community, excuse me a second, into that area. And but we also have seen other businesses now come. Now there's a semi shopping center. I'm just turning my camera in that area, and there's a there was no fire station in that area, and now that's one there because of the development that's been done in the area. And so I could go on, but I know that this can be done. And I like to tell that story, and I also to say to congregations, don't be discouraged by your size. Because a lot of times I'll tell that story and I won't say what the membership is, and people invest. So you have 5,000 members, right? I said, well, we touch 5,000 people because we see the parish. We kind of have a Catholic view. Our church is the parish, not just who comes on Sunday morning. And we have 30-some thousand people that show up online, and that has been developed since COVID. But no, I said, we're a congregation about 500 members on the book, sometimes 150 people in service, 200. I said, but that's not the issue. The issue is, what are you about? You feel you're called to. And I want to invite you all, if you ever want to come to Goldsboro, and if you ever have congregations, particularly that are in that 200 to 400 range, I'd love to work with them and say to pastors, don't say, well, when I get to 1,000 members, we're going to do this. Or no. In fact, sometimes God needs to do it the way he does it, just to prove that God is with you. And it's not just something of our own doing. Has it been without struggle? No. We lost 14% of the congregation when we started imagining, because they didn't want to go that way. They said, you don't ever need debt unless you're building a sanctuary. And we don't want all these people, because some of them might start coming to church. I mean, I literally heard that in a so-called Black church. And I don't have lawyers and doctors. So I'm like, y'all mighty bougie. These are, I'm like, you don't even want the people that you are. So we lost about 14%, not over scandal. One guy said, we're supposed to keep our money in our bank, and you got us doing all this stuff to help people. I've had my own challenges physically. We've had to turn down major grants because they did not align with. We created a CDC as a wall between the church. So no money can come from the CDC into the church. We lost some members because they wanted me to become executive director of the CDC so they didn't have to pay me to be pastor. And I said, first of all, I'm not doing that. Second of all, that's illegal. So some of them walked away. We have had to literally walk away from stuff. We've had challenges, politically, because we've said the pulpit had to be free. And never would we accept a grant in the CDC that then would limit, or somebody would think that it's going to limit the prophetic voice, of the congregation. But through it all, Greenleaf Christian Church, I think is a great model. And in the midst of it, we've been able to train. I think now, Tracy, I have 5 people at Greenleaf that have all gone through major seminaries, and 2, 3 that are now in finished, doctoral program in little old Goldsboro. People call Goldsboro Nazareth, because it used to be, if you came from Goldsboro, the first thing people said, and some of y'all know, I see you shaking your head, you from the crazy city, because all Black people that they deemed having mental issues were sent to Goldsboro. That's our history. In fact, people like myself and others who were activists in North Carolina, the way they would stop you sometimes is the sheriff would arrest you and deem you insane, send you to Goldsboro and put you in. By the time they finished shooting you up, you were insane. I mean, that literally was how they did it in North Carolina. So the Oberry Center and those centers were all Black people who had any stigma of mental illness were sent to Wayne County. So people knew that. It was also on the Chitlin circuit. But even the stars, when they came to Goldsboro, they said, oh, Lord, we're going to the crazy folks town. That's how people talked about it. And a lot of people live with that stigma because the highest paying jobs was at the mental health institution. And the president of the local NAACP, a woman she was a great woman, but this wasn't good. The power structure cut a deal with her. As long as they didn't fight too hard for integration and bring Dr. King to Goldsboro and stuff, things like that, she would get the ability to sign off on which blacks went to Oberg and got the best job, but they couldn't talk about what they saw. So there's a lot of that internalized pain, you know, in that community, and yet that's where we were called. You know, I thought about coming here today, and for this seminar, Bill Turner, and when I was in seminary, talked. He said that our spirituality needs to be triangular. I said, what do you mean? He said it has 3 points: prophetic social consciousness, worship and spirituality, and holiness. He said if you have holiness without prophetic social consciousness and worship and spirituality, then you have a sect that's unto itself. If you have prophetic social consciousness without spirituality and holiness, you're fighting injustices, but you're not going to be able to sustain it because you don't have the prophetic spirituality to lift you up and build you up. And without the holiness and being set apart, your character is not going to stay as strong as it needs to be to take the hits that are going to come. And he said, but if you have worship and spirituality without prophetic social consciousness and holiness, then you just have a party. You're having a good time in Jesus. And he said the 3 of them had to be connected, just like the triangle. I kind of look at work and movement through that, and the work we do, that triangular lens. I want to read something to you, and I want to ask a rhetorical question. Listen to this. Now, the only way to avoid a shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justice and love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must knit together in this work as one person. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, making others' conditions our own concern. Rejoice together with those who rejoice, mourn together with those who mourn, labor and suffer together. This is the only way we will be able to keep the bonds of unity and of the spirit, and to keep the unity of the spirit and the bonds of peace. And if we do this, the Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us. I often ask you, where did that come from? And people say a lot of things. That's the language of Jonathan Winthrop's message in 1600 on how America was to be a city set on a hill. He quotes Micah. He says, the only way to be a nation that avoids a shipwreck is that we care about others' needs. And yet he was sailing us to that shipwreck because he was ignoring slavery and ignoring denial of women, and even ignoring denial of the poor, because when the Constitution was written, you know, it would say that even white men without land could not participate in the vote. Neither could women, neither could Native Americans, neither could Black people. And yet he said, if we don't do these things, we're going to have a shipwreck. So sometimes when I see some of the shipwrecks we're having, it was prophesied even by those who helped push us to the shipwreck, because America has always struggled with what we say and write on paper versus what we do in practice. Another thing I'd like you to hear: benevolence provision for the poor, the orphan, and the unfortunate is the first duty of a Christian and civilized state. You know where that comes from? That's Article 11, Section 4 of the North Carolina State Constitution, written in 1868 after slavery, when Black and white people came together in Reconstruction. Listen to what they put. This is not even in the United States Constitution. They put this in a state constitution in the South. Said the only way we can really do what we ought to do and go forward is to understand benevolent provisions for the poor, the unfortunate, and the orphan must be the first duty of a civilized and Christian state. Therefore, if your first duty is not those things, but instead, how can you suppress these people? How can you cut tax for the wealthy and whatnot? Then according to their understanding, and the two people that were there, one was a Black minister named J.W. Hood, who became the president of Livingstone College, and another Black Congregationalist who was from Ohio that had moved to North Carolina. They were key writers of the North Carolina Constitution. And in their mind, if benevolence was not first place in our imagination of how we do policy, then we were acting uncivilized. And then, of course, you know, the Constitution says that the purpose of government is to establish justice and to ensure domestic tranquility. I've thought about that more and more and more, Ashley. That actually, and that's why I know that they didn't write it. The Holy Spirit got a hold of those men. They didn't write it. They didn't know what they were writing, because if they had, they wouldn't have written it, because they were all either supporting slavery or slaveholders. But they actually wrote in the Constitution, no justice, no peace. That's what that means. The purpose of the government is to establish justice and to ensure domestic tranquility. In essence, if there's no establishment of justice, there can be no domestic peace, no tranquility. And yet, what has been our struggle? What we have said on paper, what we've said with our mouths, and what we have actually done. And the reason I bring this up is because all of the great divisions in our country, you know, the Civil War happened in the church before it happened in the nation. In the 1840s, almost every church split along the lines of personhood of Black people and politics of Black people. The nation split. Then, of course, we know that Jesus said in his final words, when all is said and done, the nations are going to have to come, not individuals. I had to go back and do some stuff on that. It never, you know, because we used to say, when I was hungry, did you feed me when I was naked? And we were kind of talking personal, individualistically, like I hand somebody something. But the text actually says, when the nations, governments come before, and be separated left and right, based on their performance in this area. When I was hungry, did you feed me? Based on their imagination, Darnell, when I was naked, when I was an immigrant, did you welcome me? Thinking about all of that, thinking about what we have said and what we do, and thinking about today, coming to you all, there's a phrase one writer said, I think his name was Orwell. He said, telling the truth in a time of lies is in itself revolutionary. Another writer said that prophetic imagination must precede implementation. But prophetic imagination can never go around despair. It must go through it. You can never imagine a hope that does not go through a cross from a Christian perspective. And I think it was Jürgen Moltmann that said, real hope is when people of faith look at the nightmares and then decide that they're going to be a part of not accepting things the way they are. That is hope. That's where hope begins, right? I often say hope is like my grandmama, who had a group of women, they called themselves the prayer band. You remember, some of y'all know about prayer band. And on Saturdays, they would go out. And when grandma would get ready to go out, she put on an old apron, had all these pockets, right? In one pocket, she would put some oil, anointing oil. In another pocket, she'd pin some money to it. And then she put some rags. And I'm like, Grandma, where are you going? She said, I'm going to hope somebody. Now, in that day, you didn't correct folks. I didn't. I wouldn't have dared say, Grandmama, you mean help. You know, she said, I'm going to hope somebody. We going to hope somebody, boy. But as I grew and started thinking, I thought my grandmama knew theology and never went to seminary, because hope is actually when we become incarnate, for people, incarnate realities of new imagination, and we go out and literally help people, that we are in fact hoping them. We are giving them hope. Now, as you said, you all are imagining, how do we do that? Well, I don't think we can imagine in this world without looking at the despair. What is the world that congregations and the Benevolent Association and all of us, just in the United States, not the whole world, what are we dealing with? Well, even before the pandemic, we are dealing with the society where there are 140 million poor and low wage people in this country. The great moral ugliness of the nation, as Mayor Wright Edelman said to me one day in conversation, is not just the poverty among adults, but the fact that we let our children carry the highest rate of poverty. 52% of all children in this nation right now are in poverty and low wealth before COVID. 140 million. That's 60.9% of all Black people are poor and or low wage. That's 68% of Latinos and Native Americans. That's 30% of white people, but that 30% of white people is 66 million. 40 million more in raw numbers than the number of Black people in poverty and low wealth. 40 million. 40 million. That's 43% of the nation. The wealthiest nation in the world right now, when folks stand up to preach, when they minister in their congregation, 43% of the nation is poor and low wealth. If you pastor in the predominantly Black communities, 6 out of 10 people that you look at, I don't care what they drove, don't care what their clothes look like, they are living within $500 of economic ruin, and 52% of the children. And before COVID ever hit, there were 50 million people in this country who get up every day and work for less than a living wage. We've not raised the living wage for 12 years, 13 years now, since 2009. The living wage, the minimum wage is $7.25, but restaurant workers, a 4 million of them, make $2.13 an hour, plus tips. Most of them couldn't qualify for COVID relief because they didn't make enough base pay. They didn't make enough, and the tipping system comes out of post-slavery economics, where the former slave masters did not want to pay Black women for their work. So they said if Black women owned restaurants or if they cooked and whatnot, they would tip them rather than pay them. As we sit here tonight, there are 87 million people have health care or are uninsured. 87 million in the wealthiest nation in the world, the nation that spends the most in health care. Every congressperson that votes against health care has health care paid for by the people. And I say that because I remember going one day to Congress, and we were testifying before the finance committee, budget committee, and one of the guys who I won't even say what party he's in, he said, "I'm upset that you all are here." Myself and Reverend Liz Theo Harrison, we had these stoles on, said Jesus was a poor man. He said, first of all, you're out of order with that decorum wearing those stoles, because that, first of all, because what you have on is not true. I'm like, okay. And secondly, he said, I never knew, I've been a Christian since I was 8, and I've never read anywhere in the Bible where Jesus challenged Caesar. To which I said, so you see yourself as Caesar? We have a bigger problem than I thought. If in a democracy, you got elected, but when you got elected, you now envision yourself as Caesar, to which the church cannot critique. Before COVID ever hit, 700 people were dying every day from poverty, 250,000 people a year. And we're in a society where 10 people died from vaping, and there was a presidential level gathering and hearings on Capitol Hill. 700 people die a day from poverty, 250,000 a year. And during COVID, poor people died at a rate 2 to 5 times higher. Not black poor people, white people, all poor people died at a rate of 2 to 5 times higher than anybody else, whether it's the poorest county, white county in the state, in the country, or the poorest black county. So the pandemic didn't discriminate, but we did. And people who were the lowest wage workers, their name was changed. And most people, we said it, but we didn't ask why. Like, why did people get changed from service workers to essential workers? It was a political decision, because if you name them essential workers, they have to go to work. They're like airline pilots then. They can't stay home. They can't strike. So we named almost all poor and low income workers as essential. But during COVID, we did not guarantee them living wages, health care, paid family leave. In fact, we were protesting with church folk down in Bessemer, Alabama, against Amazon. And one of the reasons was because while Jeff Bezos has Black Lives Matters, and he's willing to buy an ad to say Black Lives Matter, 2 days into July of 2020, he cut all of the emergency pay for his workers. And he resisted doing a living wage and a wage comparative to the other places around him in a plant. 2,000 people, 97% of which were Black. And hundreds of people caught COVID, and they still did not have guaranteed paid family leave and things of that matter. So here we are. Question is, how do you imagine, what do you imagine in a reality like this, when 3 white men own as much wealth as the bottom half of the US population? That's 3 white men own more than 160 million people in this country. And 400 wealthiest people in this country make an average of $97,000 an hour. In a country that has refused to raise the minimum wage. And remember now, at the March on Washington, I tell people, if you go back, everybody goes to March on Washington to listen to King. You need to listen to Bayard Rustin's presentation of the agenda. Now, the critique on the March on Washington is they didn't let the sisters speak. That's a bad thing that they didn't. Because actually one sister brought 90,000 people, 50,000 people. She was with the United Council of Churches. But when he listed the agenda, he said, we are here to demand $2 minimum wage. Indexed with inflation, that would be 15 today, if that had happened. That was what was supposed to be in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, voting rights and living wages. That's what got compromised out. Here we are in this place we are today. And though it's hard to hear this, remember, prophetic imagination cannot ignore the despair. There was a time with the war on poverty where wages were rising and folks said, if I can just get a job, I'm okay. But today, there's not one county in America where you can work full-time with the current minimum wage and afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. And the stock for public and affordable housing is going down. It's going down. Productivity has increased by 73% since 1973. But hourly compensation has only increased 12%. And in most states, particularly in the South, we have this right to work state laws which block people's ability to organize for union representation. 73 million of the 140 million are women. The majority of poor people in this country right now, raw number, are poor white women with children. Raw numbers, not percentage. The largest percentage is within the Black community. The greatest impact, but in terms of raw numbers. Here we are where in 2016, households led by single mothers comprised almost 30% of families with incomes below the poverty line. And by the way, the government says if you make $12,100 a year, you're not poor. So the way the government measures poverty is a way designed to make the poverty problem less. And the economists say from Howard to Harvard, that if you truly want to measure poverty, you have to look at those who make within 200% of the poverty line, which is where we get the number 140 million. When you look at, for instance, how programs have been scaled back, and y'all remember when they passed the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, and they eliminated aid to families with dependent children, and they came up with TANF, temporary assistance to needy families. And they said, oh, folk, go to work without providing living wages and a lot of work. But many people were kicked off of the very assistance they needed. And it only hurt more people in the low wage economy. Here we are in this moment that we live in. And for every 100 extremely low income renters, only 35 will find affordable housing. Only 35 will find affordable housing. A government survey of people who were homeless in 2017 found out that 41% of homeless people are Black, 47% are white, 22% are Latino. A majority of homeless families are headed by single women. And the problem of homelessness is particularly acute among LGBTQ youth, who represent between 5 and 10% of the nation's young people, but 20 to 40% of the nation's young homeless people. So homelessness now is connected to who you love. How do you imagine in this reality? How do you imagine reality like Ezekiel had to imagine when in Ezekiel 22, he says, your politicians have become like wolves and your preachers have endorsed it. Therefore, injustice is rapid and rampant. And then he says, God says, I'm looking for one person that'll stand in the gap. You know, Ezekiel didn't find that until 15 chapters later down in the Valley of Dry Bones. The hope was found among the very people who had been ravaged by the wolves. 2.5 to 3.5 million people sleep in shelters every night in America, but there are estimated 7.4 million people who are on the brink of homelessness in this country. And you know what happened during COVID? They passed a law that said, we'll give you a moratorium on paying your rent and water. But here's what they said. You get a moratorium for 3 months, but in the 4th month, you got to pay the 3 months plus the 4th month. Now, billionaires made $2 trillion so far during COVID, $2 trillion. And corporations are now buying up housing stock and reselling it. Many times in what was a halfway affordable communities, and now they're changing those. How do you imagine? How do you imagine 50 million people working every day for less than $15 an hour? That's 47% of Black workers. Think about that. We saw 48 senators who are Republicans, 2 who are Democrat, vote against 47% of Black workers. With one vote, they stopped 47% of Black workers, 46% of Hispanic workers, 25% of white workers, and 40% of women from rising up out of low wages. One vote. They said no. In fact, the senator from Arizona did this and danced. I don't know if y'all saw it. She was just dancing. I'm so happy to block all of these people and keep them. How do you imagine? How do you imagine? And then finally, when we look at access to water, oh yeah, we're saying what? It's not just Flint, it's Jackson, it's all over. 4 million families get up every morning and can buy unleaded gas and cannot buy unleaded water. 4 million families. Then we look at the high poverty and hurt of indigenous communities. The stories that are often not told, where indigenous people are still living under wartime treaties. Right now in Arizona, the Apache Nation is fighting to hold on to their land and fighting to hold on to their Mecca, their national cathedral, their Mount Sinai, because the government has decided to give that federal land to a multinational company to go in and drill for some minerals, which 97% of what they bring up is unusable. Only 3% is usable. And they're willing to tear that whole group of people's culture apart and destroy their lives. How do you imagine? How do you imagine? How do you imagine in the midst of a climate crisis? How do you imagine that since 2001, we spent $21 trillion on war and militarizing our borders and our communities and incarcerate $21 trillion. And we know right now that if we took one military contract from Boeing for 1 year, we could pay for every person in every state that has denied the Affordable Care Act. Every one of them. And why is that important? Because 330,000 people died during COVID, not from COVID, but from the lack of health care. The lack of health care. And 60% of the people who died, of the 1-point-some million people, did not have to die. My daughter's a public health specialist, graduated from Harvard. She works now at Drexel University. My son's an environmental lawyer. And one of the things they sat down telling me is, Daddy, they said, Daddy, sometimes when we're doing our work, because we see this stuff, we just find ourselves weeping because none of this stuff had to happen. My daughter said, we knew exactly COVID was coming and how to fight it, but all for greed and lies and racism. How do you imagine? Well, how do you imagine in a time when since 2021, 19 states, and actually since 2013, over 24 states have passed racist voter suppression laws. And today, because of what's been passed just in the last year, 55 million voters, not Black voters, 55 million voters in this country will not have the same access to the polls in October and November than they had in 2020. Now, somebody might say, well, Pastor, good gracious, every time you talk, you're always doing this stuff. You cannot have a prophetic imagination that ignore it. It's not just name it and claim it, call it and haul it. That's not Bible. You got to go through. But actually inside of all those ugly numbers is a great deal of hope. First thing is that everything I just named can be ended with policy. With policy. Not, and with efforts by the church, what you're doing, what Reverend Blackmon has been doing on for getting people's health indebtedness forgiven, what benevolence, but alongside that policy, there's not one issue that I just named that could not be dealt with by addressing policy. Policy. That's why I believe anybody or body of people that are involved and really want to imagine a new world, we must train our people how to speak to policy and challenge policymakers, just like the prophets did. Just wasn't Jesus always up in folks' face? I don't mean you got to be kicking them, but we have to let folk understand that there's not one thing I just know that is beyond our reach. It's policy. 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 If we just implemented the child income tax credit permanently, 50% of child poverty would end immediately. We paid people $15 an hour, 50 million people would rise up out of low wages to a decent wage immediately. Immediately. If we took 10% of the military budget, which is over $800 billion, more, and if you cut that in half, we still have more money in our military budget than Iran, Iraq, Russia, and China combined, 10% could fundamentally shift policy. Universal health care would simply mean that we're doing what 25 other wealthiest countries in the world already do. Policy. Part of our imagining has to be, how do we build in the community? How do we build? That's why at Greenleaf, we say to Greenleaf, yes, we have done $14 million of development, but alongside that, we have to be engaged in setting a policy and challenging bad policy. In other words, it's both and, not either or. Take, for instance, the issue of voter suppression. Why must we be involved in the fight to get people to vote and the fight against voter suppression? Because voter suppression is not just about Black folk, it's about policy. If you don't believe it's about policy, ask one question. Why is it that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is against two things, raising the minimum wage and increasing opportunity to vote? U.S. Chamber of Commerce, right? Why is it that every person who put an extremist judge on the Supreme Court also is against voter suppression? I mean, for voter suppression. And why is it that the judges, that the people who are for voter suppression, the judges that they often nominate, if you check their record, 97% of the time they vote on behalf of corporations. They believe in treating corporations like people and people like things. We have to follow the policy and follow the money. And we have to know that if 140 million people are poor and low wealth, then that means that poor people are a force to be reckoned with. Maybe it wasn't always the case, but you know, the Bible says that they kept messing with those Hebrews and messing with them and making them build brick with no straw until Pharaoh looked up and said, wait a minute, they are more than we are. So yes, there are 140 million poor and low wealth people, but do you know poor and low wealth people also now make up 45% of the electorate? In every state where the margin of victory is less than 2%, 3%, and in poor and low wealth people, if we mobilize 1 to 20% of them, in most places it's only 1 to 10% that have not voted before around a real democracy, justice agenda, poor and low wealth people can determine who sits in office. If you determine who sits in office, you determine policy. So I think when we talk about benevolence, and we talk about imagining, we have to talk about, like that triangle, you know, talk about social consciousness, holiness, and spiritual, and worshiping and spirituality. We have to connect policy, then the programs we do through our associations like benevolence in our churches, and people. People, policy, program, people, policy, program, program, policy, people. You got programs without focusing on people and policies, you'll do things, but it'll be like pulling one person out at a time rather than going and finding who's throwing people in the river in the first place. If you have policy focus, but no focus on building up people, then you'll be out here, you know, fighting for the policy while people at home are struggling. They aren't finding any help around them. If you just focus on getting people in the church, but you don't care about policy and program, then we make the Gnostic sin of only caring about people's souls and not caring about the conditions that damn their bodies and destroy them. So we've been saying all over the country, there are 5 interlocking injustices we have to address. We have to be a part of our theological talk, systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. Any imagination about going forward, I believe, has to see these 5 things as interlocking evils of our time that must be addressed in our preaching, in our Bible studies, in our practice, in our prophetic utterances. And then we must challenge 3 lies, and I'm through. Take any question. 3 lies. 1, the lie of scarcity. There's no scarcity of resources. And those who say there is are just like Judas. They just want to use it to steal. You know, Jesus said that about Judas. He was always talking about, well, no, he just want to keep the money for himself. There's no scarcity of resources. There's no scarcity of programs and policies. We actually know what to do to address issues. What there is a scarcity of moral consciousness, prophetic moral consciousness. Now, an atheist told me that. Strange to say. I was at the UN and I was meeting with the rapporteur, International Rapporteur for Poverty and Despair. And after we met, he pulled me to the side and said, Pastor, he said, I'm not a man of faith. He said, but I need to say something to you. If there was a God, I know what a God-sized problem is. He said, and I'm not a person of faith, and it's probably even wrong for me to ask this of you or say this to you. He said, but if you who focus on that don't work and fight to shift the moral imagination and moral consciousness of this nation, we're in trouble, and we can't do it. He said, I know the programs, I know the policies, but I recognize a God-sized problem when I see one, and the moral consciousness of this nation, and fighting not one fight, but the long fight of shifting it is in your backyard, in your front yard. It's in your purview. It's in your toolkit. He said, and I hope to God. He literally said that. He said, I hope to God that you all are serious about building this moral movement. Because we do not have, and he was the one that said that. He said, Pastor, we do not have a lack of resources. We do not have a lack of programs, initiatives, and policies of what to do. What we have is a lack of moral consciousness. And that's part of the reimagining that our congregations must engage in, to be instruments and voices and committed to reshaping of the moral consciousness, not some of the time, all the time, because the Pew Foundation put out a study, what's her name? Dr. Is that Lynn? Is that Lynn? Dr. Sessions, yeah. They put out a study and it hurt me to my heart. Actually, I cried when I read it. They did a study on the American pulpit, I think 2 years ago. And and they did a word search of what came up in our pulpit. They said the number one phrase that came up in many Black circles was hallelujah. I kid you not, praise the Lord. In white congregations, it was things like creed, doctrinal, whatever. Poverty did not register. Think about that now. They looked at 50,000 congregations and the sermon in 50,000 pulpits over a period of time. And poverty, or addressing the issues of poor, did not register 1%. Didn't register. They couldn't even measure it. And yet, Jesus started his ministry. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor. So a part of our reimagining must be reimagining what we say, because the power of life and death is in the tongue. And if the church is not at least telling the truth, how can it be revolutionary? Because telling the truth in a time of lies is revolutionary in and of itself. Thank you.
Reverend Barber, we thank you for your witness, for your wisdom, and for your work. This reminds me that it takes courage for us to imagine. Deep courage. Yeah. We look upon the realities of what we're facing. I want us to kind of expand this conversation as we have a virtual room full of courageous imaginers. I want to just lift up those names briefly. You may have already engaged their work through their pre-recorded seminars as they too are imagining. We have Reverend Traci Blackmon, where she's imagining a world where all children thrive. Reverend Dr. Irie Session, where there are no barriers for Black women. And Reverend Jonathon Murillo, who's imagining a new way to lead. And we want to invite them into the conversation while also being mindful of questions that may have emerged for Reverend Barber during this time. So we're going to give Reverend Barber just a moment to kind of settle into all that he said and catch his breath. We're going to ask a question to our panelists just to kind of spread out the voices, and then we have a question we'll come back to that we have already prepared for Reverend Barber based on what he has shared this evening. So Ashley, if you mind sharing our first question.
And I hope I didn't go over there because I was told I had 35 minutes. So if that was a typo, then it wasn't on me. I just want y'all to know. Okay, I'm all right.
It's fine.
I didn't want y'all to, when you started saying other boys, I go, oh, okay, all right. We're good, Tracy? I'm good, all right, okay.
Yes, sir, thank you.
Yeah, so we want to invite you all, our panelists, to this question of what does a world look like that does work for everyone? We know that you've kind of spoken to maybe some sentiment on that in your workshops, but where do we start? What does the world look like that works for everyone?
I will go ahead and start and jump this off if that's okay. In my seminar, my topic was imagine a world where there are no barriers to Black women's flourishing. And I talked about some research that was done by Goldman Sachs. They have an initiative, 10 million Black women, where they have gone in and done some really good work. It's work that many of us as Black women, many of us who are involved in the social, political atmosphere of our world were already aware of some of these findings, but we didn't have the data necessarily behind it. But Goldman Sachs has done that. And so to answer your question, what would it look like in a world where all people flourished? I would say these three things that Goldman Sachs did and discovered. Number one, their focus was primarily on Black women. They listened to Black women. They learned from Black women, and they made a commitment to invest in Black women. So a world where there is unilateral flourishing is a world that listens to the voices of the people that are the most marginalized, right? That have been voiceless. There is a commitment to listen to, but not just to listen, but to learn from, to see what those voices have to say, because they know those voices of marginalized persons, of Black women, of LGBTQIA folks, of differently abled or otherly abled folk. They know what they need. And so to learn from them, but on top of all that, then to invest in those communities, those persons. So it's not just about listening to and learning from, but there's got to be some exchange of resources, of capital. There's got to be some putting your money where your mouth is, right? So in a world where, there is unilateral flourishing, I think that those three things must exist. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Might I chime in a little bit with Dr. Sessions and lift up Roz Pellis, who's not on the call. But Roz Pellis, and what you said, I love that session about learning from and listening to, because people know what they need. And also corporations have the responsibility to say all that they can do, because sometimes folk don't even know all that's available, right? So it's kind of like asking for something without knowing what you really could demand. The second thing is, we started a fight yesterday, and I got an emergency call from Mary Kay Henry, who's a gay woman, leads SEIU. And what's the sister used to be with Demos, I'll think of her name in a minute. But anyway, so we got to get on this call. So what is going on? They said Black and Latino women in California just won 3 weeks ago through legislation a bill that says now corporations in the fast food industry must sit with them, listen to them, learn from them, and share with them in profits. Yesterday, 2 days ago, the corporations decided they were going to engage in a form of financial insurrection. And rather than abide by the ruling, McDonald's and some of these other corporations were going to put up all this money to now make it go to a referendum and try to get the people to overturn what the women want. So there was a meeting with McDonald's. And you know how all these corporations were saying, we for Black Lives Matter, they wanted to put up a slogan, Black Lives Matter, but no, McDonald's, Black Lives Matter, Burger King, Black Lives Matter. And they say, well, how is it that your corporation would say you were for Black Lives Matter over here, but now you're going to fight a policy that's going to lift up Black women and Latino women over here? So we have to ask SACS. They do all these folks, they do a lot of studies because they want to know what the market is. And sometimes there's one more thing we have to ask them. Who are you investing in now? And what policies are you backing? Show us your show us what your investment is, right? Like, we had a meeting with the NFL and we said to Roger, you have a PAC, right? He said, yes, show us who you support. Well, I'm not sure we can do it. No, if you say you support Black Lives Matter, then you need to show us who you support, because if you're supporting the people that also are pushing against healthcare, pushing against voter suppression, then actually what you're doing is investing and divesting at the same time, which ends up being like 1 plus a negative 1. Equals 0. So
and I agree.
Yeah.
And here's what and we can talk about it later, or you all can do, research the Goldman Sachs. And they're not the only ones. They're not the only ones who've done this research, but they have an initiative where they are investing in Black women in a lot of different areas to the tune of $10 million. And so it is, and granted, it's benefiting them. No one is going to, invest if they're not getting some kind of benefit from it. But my point is, for this first question, was the listening to, the learning from, and the commitment to invest in that we've got to do. And that investing, as far as I'm concerned, and all those 3 things, the church needs to be doing that. The church needs to be doing that research, as in terms of where are the inequities in this denomination? Where are the racial inequities? Where are the gender inequities, right? And then listening to those people, those groups, and learning from them and investing in them in ways that they have not done before.
Thank you all for your responses to those questions. I have a question specifically to think about our session, Imagining a World Where All God's Children Thrive, which was led by Reverend Traci Blackmon. And there are people that we work with daily who are doing work around supporting youth and children. And I would ask a question, and what would you say to those who feel called to work toward wholeness for our children? Where do we start?
Well, Thank you for the question, Darnell. Can I say Darnell? And it's always great to be in this room with people that I know. I appreciate this invitation, Ashley, to join you, and glad to see my sister, Dr. Irie, and my brother, Bishop, who put all that food and singing up, and now I need to come back to Greenleaf so that I can see my people. And I have not yet met you, Jonathon, but I look forward to getting to know you in this space. I'm going to link the answer to that question from my perspective to the first question, because when Ashley asked about how do I imagine a world that works for everyone, I am a preacher in my bones. Like I know 3 of the people who are joining me here are, and I imagine the Acts 2 church. I imagine a church where people came and they brought what they had and everybody got what they needed, right? And the text doesn't say that they brought all they had, but they brought enough so that everybody could at least have what they needed. And in a world that works for everyone, I think that the church deconstructs and reconstructs a theology of chosenness and abundance as a sign of God's favor. I think in a world that works for everyone, that is based on a sufficiency level, right? And so now I'm going to link it to what you asked me about. How do we get to this thing that works for children? Well, it's more than positive affirmations, though they need affirmations. And it's more than prayer, though they need prayer. And it's more than us reading books. And they need reading books, but we need some policy changes that center children, because children don't live by themselves, right? And so if you center a child, you are centering the whole family, because the child's context has to be nourishing in order for a child to thrive. And so a couple of the ways that I wanted to lift up about that, just for conversation or for challenge or for pushback, is there was recently an episode put out by NPR that talked about the impact of COVID on education, right? And it said that the places where poverty was the highest, the kids spent more time in remote learning than the people who lived in areas that were not impoverished. 5.5 more weeks was spent in remote instruction for impoverished neighborhoods than it was for other neighborhoods. And I choose to live in the hood. And so I recognize that the children that surround me, they were still on the screens when other people were going back to school, right? And some of them were on the screens because they didn't have enough educators in the school buildings to take all the kids back to school. Some of them were on the screens because it made it easier for the administrators to get credit for their attendance, even though they weren't really monitoring whether the children were paying attention. And so this notion that poor children spent more time on a screen than children everywhere else had a kind of a domino effect, because also those children in high poverty areas, they stayed remote the majority of 20 and 21, which meant that they missed the equivalent of 22 weeks of school, right? Because they weren't learning at the same level. 22 weeks of school for a child who's learning math, who's learning English, who's learning history, who's learning what they need to go to the next level. What does that mean for them now? What does that mean for them now? And that wasn't happening everywhere. People who could afford to send their children to private school, they weren't having this issue. People who lived in wealthy, affluent neighborhoods and went to public school there, they weren't having these issues. So I think if we're really serious about a world that thrives, we will reassess the way we fund public school education. We would stop funding public school education by property taxes that are designated for the schools in that region. Why wouldn't we collect all of the property taxes for the whole state and then distribute them equitably at best, equally at least, to all the children who are in need? Why should a child have to suffer because they are born into an economic system, a racist economic system that was built for them not to succeed, because we have systems where the wealthy only have to take care of themselves and the poor take care of are on their own. So that's one way I think that we thrive. The other way I think we thrive is what, if you ever spend more than 10 minutes with Bishop Barber, you're going to hear him talk about people need a living wage. Families need to be paid what they are worth, right? And that doesn't happen. I agree 100% with everything Dr. Irie said about Black women. But the women that Goldman Sachs are looking at are largely already accomplished women, right? They've already made a name and they're worth investing in, and they should be invested in because we need our voices out here. But children also who have not even made that level yet, they need a family to surround them that makes a living wage. We have not increased the federal minimum wage in this country since 2009. Everything else has tripled. Everything else has skyrocketed, especially after COVID. And I don't know this number exactly, Bishop, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think if you work for a federal minimum wage and you worked every hour of every day, you still would not be able to afford rent for a 2-bedroom apartment for your family. Anywhere in the United States, including the District of Columbia, you would not be able to do it. So if we want to see children thrive, we have to invest not just in their minds, but in their surroundings, in their families, in their neighborhoods. We have to decide that we want to be like Acts 2 and bring what we have to the center so that everyone could at least have what they need. We're not even talking abundance, we're talking sufficiency.
That's right.
I believe sufficiency is the will of God for our lives. If you talk abundance as a blessing, then you only know abundance if someone else has lack. If you talk scarcity as a sign of God's disfavor or your inadequacy, then you limit God. But everybody that is created in the image of God, that's a God-bearing image, should have sufficiency. Sufficiency of food, sufficiency of clean water, sufficiency of education, sufficiency of healthcare. That's what I mean when I say that children should thrive. I'm sorry that was long-winded.
No. And Daria, can I say something to my sister? Because Traci, I'm hearing you preach, and then I look at the Declaration of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that the United States signed off on 70 years ago, claiming that all these things should be fundamental human rights. And that's what I meant by when we talk with like a corporation that then lobbies against living wages. I mean, the Bible says in Isaiah 58, that's evil. I mean, that's what the Bible says, wicked. Because when in Hebrew, when it says loose the bands of wickedness in Isaiah 58, the Hebrew translation is pay people what they deserve. Stop paying people less than they deserve. And what we do to family, the ergonomics of that, I was just thinking, if you got behind 22 days, my brother that died was a specialist in ergonomics. Like if you take 2 seconds and look this way on the road, then what does that do? You know how it creates a backlog? Because if everybody's taking 2 seconds, then the line gets longer and longer and longer. So it might be a 2-second look at the front of the line, but it's a 2-hour look 2 miles down the road. So if 22 days were lost, what's the ergonomics of that over 10 years, over 5 years? And then on top of that, as Blackmon said, not only is you can't afford, in North Carolina, for instance, you got to work 87 hours a week. In California, it's 130 hours a week. And so one of the challenges for the church is how we choose to speak. I remember when, and the LGBT community, when in Indiana, for instance, passed something challenging the LGBT community, and our church denomination said we will move our denominational split. And I agreed with it. I'm not against it. But when we saw 49 senators, Republicans, and 2 Democrats say no to 50 million people, and no to a Black woman. I want you to hear this. I'll take a little bit. Kamala Harris, I'm not talking about a Democrat, a Black woman would have given the final vote that would have given 50 million people a raise. Forget the color for a second. A woman, a Black woman, if they had not voted to keep it out of the reconciliation, she would have, when she did this, that one vote from her, a woman, a Black woman, would have raised the wages for 50 million for the children of family. I contend that the Good Old Boy Network wasn't going to let that happen, right? Because we're going to let that happen. But here's the thing. You, Traci, did, others, a lot of socials did, but in many, many places, that vote was not even seen as sinful. It was not called out. It was not talked about in the pulpit, or even beforehand. You know, I asked a group of clergy in West Virginia to write Manchin and say, you must pass living wage, because half of West Virginia is poor and low wealth. 350,000 people in West Virginia make less than a living wage. I met with white women up in the mountains, Traci, who every Tuesday have to sell tacos. These are low wage, minimum wage work. They sell tacos every Tuesday so they can create a pool of money so when they have their menstrual cycles, they can have money to help with. I mean, that's how gross it is. And they shared that with me, and they told Manchin that. I asked some clergy, they said, oh, but that's not a faith issue for us. That's not it. We shouldn't, we don't have to do that. Poor gonna be with you always. But our sister just said sufficiency at the very least has got to be the heart of whatever imagination we're doing.
So a question for me that goes back to these 3 points that I offered, right? We know this. Those that have the power and the ability to make this kind of transformative change are not listening. Are not listening to the voices, are not listening to what we know is true. And so I think that's the question that we have to wrestle with, the why. Why are they not listening, right? And why are they not learning from all of this information that we have, right? And investing in doing something different about it, right? So it's, for me, it's still about people are not listening.
Do you think, Dr. Irie, and I listen to you a lot because Dr. Irie, besides this, has a powerful church online.
Yes, God. Yes,
that
God.
reminds me to remember who I am. That's one of the things I always take away from that. Do you think they aren't listening or they don't want to hear? Because it's hard not to see what's happening in this world. And it might be the cynic in me, but I don't know how anyone lives in this world and doesn't see. I think it's intentional. Second Kings 24 talks about the Babylonian exile, right? And I keep that scripture with me because it points to the fact that they didn't take everybody into exile. They chose the people they would take into exile. They took the artisans, they took the smiths, they took the warriors, they took the workers, they took the dreamers.
That's right.
But they left everybody else.
Right.
And I see our society mimicking that. I think that people who get tapped to have special talents, special gifts, we'll pull those children out of the public schools in their neighborhood and put them in the special schools. We'll take and make one hero, right? We can leave Brittany Griner in Russia because we got Serena. And I feel like they do see And I want to be convinced differently. I believe they see and they hear, and that we are so consumed with getting more and greed that they're not willing to pay the cost to bring things to the table. I hope I'm wrong.
Dr. Irie, I think it's some are listening, some aren't listening. I think it's and who's speaking, and it's no one single answer. If the pulpits of our country, where all of these people claim they go to church because they all have said, at least for political reasons, if they don't even hear anything from the pulpit about the poor, then are we speaking properly? Then on the other hand, when we're building movements like the Poor People's Campaign, I mean, some of my worst days have been calling on some of our people, and I'm talking about some Black groups. Well, are the gay folk going to be a part of it? Well, are you going to have what about these other religions? I'm talking about came from folk that look like me. I'm saying, do you see this agenda? Do you see this agenda? Thank God the UCC and the Christian church haven't been like that. Then we've got to build long enough. King said that the greatest fear of the aristocracy in this country was for the masses of poor and wealth, Black people and white people coming together in a fusion coalition that could fundamentally shift the economic architecture of the country, which is why, folk get killed. And then greed. I mean, we can't take away just straight up, when Biden, now I'm not pushing it, I just have to talk historically. When we knew we were going to get living wages on the table, the Chamber of Commerce went into action. And I don't have time to show, but I could pull up that. And they literally called in markers to everybody they had invested in. And in essence said, there are two things you must make sure is not in anything: Build Back Better, living wages and expanded voting rights. Because expanding voting rights is going to get people at the table who not only listen, but can be forced to move and to act. I think, like Traci, that guy who said to me that day, and he got a lot of amens, I ain't seen nowhere in the Bible where Jesus challenged Caesar. I think he hears very clearly. I think there is a deep fear of equity. Not even, as what you say, Traci, not people having more, but just basic equity, just basic subsistence. And it's been something that's with us as a nation. And we have to have a moral fusion movement long term that's committed to that. We can't walk away from the political battles. And then the last thing, I do believe this in my heart, in my most cynical and hurtful and depressed days, I keep going back to something they said in South Africa. And Bishop Tutu told me this one time, and I keep it with me hidden down there when I get really he said, Barbara, we say in South Africa that only a dying mule kicks the hardest. I said, what, Bishop? We say in South Africa, only a dying mule kicks the hardest. You must know that when your oppression is the greatest, when they are at their most opposing for, when they do everything, when they spend pornographic sums of money to block you from the very basic things of just voting, it is not because they are alive, it is because they are dying, and they see you rising and they see the numbers changing, and they know their world view is coming to an end, and they are trying to prolong. And I think we're in a place now where, if 45% of the electorate is poor and low wealth, but at the same time, the number one reason poor, low wealth people say they have not voted from Appalachia to Alabama is nobody talks to us. Now, some people jump and say, well, that ain't no excuse. No. Hear what they're saying for a minute. Nobody talks to us. When have we had, not only in the church a sermon, but tell me the last time there's been a presidential debate on what Traci just talked about, changing public education so that we get the least of these and living wages. There hasn't been one public debate on just those two issues. If you get this office, that means the narrative is all messed up. So again, I think sometimes folk aren't hearing, but sometimes what they are hearing is not what they need to hear. And then lastly, we got to probe around how are we really speaking. We don't have time to do that here today, but I'd love to enjoy that conversation with you. Maybe we need to, you and Traci and some others need to do a podcast on that about listening and hearing and speaking.
Yeah, I want to invite Jonathon to jump in here, especially because his workshop was specifically on a new way to lead. And so, Jonathon, much of our audience are people of faith and faith leaders. And so in your workshop, you use the term courageous collaboration. And so I'm curious how you lead those in your circle of faith to listen, to learn. How do you invite people into that narrative and that willingness to invest?
Well, thank you for that invitation, and it's grateful to be here and to just bear witness to these incredible teachers and practitioners, and blessings to all y'all in the thick of it, building, your ventures, your answer to some of what we're holding together in your context. I appreciate that. Yeah, when we think about courageous collaboration, it's really an invitation to reject the status quo of shallow individualism, right? We talk about that, and individually we know that as leaders, or if we've served under leaders, who you can point to that and see the log in their eye, right, or the speck in their eye, and say that they lead from a shallow individualistic place. Decisions are driven by ego, but also in our organizations it looks like silos, and in our denominations it looks like competing over resources. And so courageous collaboration, I think, is even to the question that was raised in the chat, was how do we need to be formed to be able to collaborate together? Back to the original question of what does the world look like where all can thrive? One of my unique, perspectives here is that I'm a millennial, and I work with a lot of millennials. I work with a lot of Gen Z, and sometimes I work with teams who serve on college campuses, which is like a microcosm of the world in 10 years. It is a microcosm of people who will be making decisions of policy and communication, and in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And so I had a pastor mentor of mine say, whatever your calling is, if you work on a college campus, it's going to come to you. And so we have, international students coming. We have people from all different places and upbringings coming in to campus. And when I'm sitting in sometimes these conduct conversations with students who have, crossed covenants, crossed community guidelines, they're in trouble. I'm sitting with these students, and I think what I'm seeing is that it's because they haven't ever in their life had this much agency, and ever in their life encountered this much difference than what they're used to. And so thinking about agency and difference, and agency we know becomes power, and power becomes power dynamics, and power dynamics become the principalities and powers, right? And so we're thinking about agency in these students who have never in their life been able to make the kinds of decisions they're making, and then they're encountering difference of people and communities they've never had to learn how to live with. That's where things go awry. And so I think when we're thinking about a world that does work for everybody, it's when we hopefully, by the faithful witness of the church, be formed enough to hold our power, and differences leading to belonging, differences leading to a belonging and a community that doesn't make sense except for by the power of the Spirit, except for by our formation and the bonds of our baptism. And that's the unique opportunity we have as leaders and people of faith. And so courageous collaboration is first that courage to be formed, the courage to go within, the courage to participate in a community of faith and belonging and accountability, so that we can then also open ourselves up to the input, listening, engagement of other stakeholders, and I think that is vulnerable. I mean, I find working with a lot of leaders, we perpetuate some of that cycling of like keeping us at the center, right? We bemoan it, we lament it, of us having to do everything, but still we kind of reinforce it in similar ways. And so the courage to bring people in earlier, instead of saying, can you fill out this feedback survey, saying, let us look at this problem with all the power to be able to even just look at it without pre-formed solutions and strategies, but can we behold it with honesty and authenticity, and be shaped by just the holding of pain together. That's vulnerable for a leader to think about collaboration. We want to be the leader that's coming down Sinai with the plans already set. And especially when we're working with donors and grants and and everything, we're trying to say, here's the plans. But I think a courageous collaboration is a courage to be formed and to think about our own agency and also the honoring of agency to form a shared power that can be mobilized in collaboration. So those are the things that come to mind. And again, I'm grateful to be with y'all.
That's fine. Ashley, can I make one thing before I have to step into another gathering? I do want to offer something to folk on the chat. You know, repairs of the breach. Jonathon, I want to have a conversation with you, Jonathon, because what we have said is that when we look at history, there is no fundamental change that did not come through what we call moral fusion coalitions, where people came together, often people who were deliberately torn apart, like what happened post-slavery when poor whites and former slave blacks came together to form Reconstruction. It wasn't just black, it was a black and white people who figured out we were both hurt in some ways by racism and slavery, and they did some powerful things. I could go down the line, I won't do that. But repairs of the breach that I work with, people are asking on the chat, one of the things we do is come in communities by invitation. And we do a training called MPOLIS, the Moral Political Organizing Leadership Institute and Seminar, which takes the Reconstruction model, the Luke 4, the Acts 2, and the Ezekiel 37 and the Nehemiah model. And we talk about what does that look like in the time in which we live? How can people come together and form moral fusion coalitions? How do you map what is the power of pressure points that you have to touch together collectively? How do you hold a fusion coalition together that has leadership, but is not just one-sided and welcomes people? And how do we get white people to talk about racism, black people to talk about climate change, and all people to talk about how these are interlocking injustices that you can't take one at a time? And how do you recognize that oftentimes the hope lies in the people who've been hurt the most? You know, the valley of dry bones is where Ezekiel finally found the people that God said would stand in the gap. So I want to just throw that in the person. And then, as you know, the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. I don't know if people know, we never call that an organization, it's a campaign. You know, it's undergirded by Kairos Center with Liz Steele Harris, myself with Repairs of Breach. But it's, you know, 300 other groups, it's 2,500 clergy, it's 38 state coordinate. It's a campaign, because what we said was, at the very least, if poverty is not even in the narrative, we got to change the narrative before we let out the policy. That's what June 18th was about. It wasn't an end, it was a declaration. It wasn't a march, it was an assembly. It was a reason why the first 120 minutes was people, impacted people standing together that normally wouldn't be together, like white farmers from Kansas on the stage standing together, sharing their stories, demanding they won't be silent, right along black folk from the Carolinas. There was a reason why that picture went out. And I hope folk will take a look. If you can go to PPC and click on the June 18th, it's about a 4-hour piece, but to see community forming, the front end, not the back end. We've only been at this 3 years, and 2 of those years were interrupted with COVID. And then lastly, you know, I want to invite people in this season. You know, the prophets were concerned about policy. Jesus was certainly, policy. We're right now working not to mobilize 5 million poor, low wealth voters, low wage voters who are Democrats or Republicans, but who are looking at democracy through the lens of living wages, the children, healthcare, and evaluating candidates. We ain't trying to vote for Jesus, but where do these candidates stand on these critical issues that line up with our faith, the categories of faith Jesus lays out in Luke 4 and Matthew 25, and the prophets laid out, and the real pain. And how do we use this power? Because we've looked at the metrics. Poor, low wealth people can flex their muscles in a way that determines who's enough, but then they got to stay engaged. But we have a moment in right now. So if persons are interested in helping to do that, they go to the PPC. We've just launched a campaign called If We Ever Need to Vote for Democracy and Justice, We Sure Do Need to Vote Now. But it's not about we just need to vote because what happened on January 6th, because those of us who live in the hood, who've been a part of oppressed community, we've seen insurrections a lot of times. I'm not dismissing what happened on January 6th. I'm simply saying that's not been the only instance of violence and hurt. What we're saying, though, is when people say democracy is on the line, we say, no, no, it's not. That's an idea. You need to say democracy is on the line, but because until the children are treated right, you don't have a democracy. Till folk have a living wage, you don't have democracy. Till Black women, till we deal with it, healthcare, that's what you have to say. And then where are the people that have been the most marginalized, but have some of the greatest power right now in this country? You know, in Michigan, for instance, I'll stop here. Do you know it would only take 1% of poor, low-wealth voters in Michigan to determine that they could close the gap of victory in any campaign? 4% in Florida, 7% in Georgia, 19% in North Carolina, 20% in Texas. Not 80% of people, there's not a state where if under 23% of poor, low-wealth voters were to vote around an agenda that empowers and lifts from the bottom, where poor, low-wealth people could not, in fact, determine who sits in every political office. We cannot leave that power on the table. And I think the church ought to be right in the center of helping to mobilize the people and to sing that hymn that grew out of, was it Porgy and Bess? I think it says, make them hear you. You know, there comes a time, Dr. said, you're right, you got to make them hear you, you know, and you got to cry loud and spare not. And so I want to invite people, if they're interested, to go to PPC, sign up. We need people who can call and mobilize, not inviting people to vote. We're not doing that. We're inviting people to be a part of a movement that votes. So a lot of people get sick and tired of people just coming and saying, vote in this election season, then after that, you go away. We have no tolerance for that. It's about doing more, mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating, building a movement that votes that's deeply rooted in our deepest faith traditions and our moral traditions. Thank you, Esther.
Thank you. I don't know if you need to step away, but we thank you for being a part of this conversation. Our time is slipping away from us, but I want to ask this question that actually kind of highlights one of our questions in the chat, which is about what are the type of spiritual disciplines that is conducive to having a prophetic voice? And I would add to that question, as those who are imagining and practitioners in this work of living into your imagination, how are you taking care of yourself? I don't want us to be so big picture that we think about the day-to-day maintenance of what it means to live into and live out this work. So what are the spiritual practices that help cultivate your prophetic voice? And then how are you taking care of yourself? That's for everyone, all three of our panelists left.
Well, I'd be happy to start us off. I think the discipline that's kept me, I think, not so much that I've kept, but that's kept me, I think, in this season and in this work has been Sabbath. Now, I grew up in a Pentecostal tradition that was, for all of its, I'm proudly a part of that tradition and come from that tradition, but it was very legalistic. And so Sabbath was, what we didn't do on the Lord's Day. But Sabbath keeping, I think for me, and especially for those that I work with who, young people being on the other end of all these algorithms that are designed to keep them distracted, keep us from seeing all that we've been bearing witness to today, to keep us trapped in this cycle of productivity and, the work-life enmeshment that we find ourselves in, where even people who are committed to ministry and to justice work still find ourselves in this toxic hustle that I spoke about in the workshop. What Sabbath has been for me, and there's a lot about the how, right? Many traditions have a lot to say about how, but has invited me, I think, to move from the economy of Egypt into the economy of Eden, and that sufficiency that we've talked about. And so for me, it hasn't been as much of like a hashtag soul care, self-care kind of thing that my generation is obsessed with, as much as it has been an act of spiritual protest, to say that, to myself, I am not reduced to what I produce. And so then I have eyes to see where in my neighborhood am I being shaped to inform, to see people as reduced to what they produce. Where am I letting, this unchecked imperialistic capitalism shape how I internalizing that, but then also how that is affecting the way that I treat or vote or vote with my dollars around those in my community. And so for me, I think Sabbath has been something that is formative, that it has been revitalizing, but it's also been something that keeps me seeing and keeps me, again, this act of protest towards the economy of Eden over the economy of Egypt.
I'll go next. Spiritual disciplines for years now, I set myself to rise at 4 a.m. and I dance with God for at least an hour. And sometimes that's prayer, sometimes that's quiet, sometimes it's meditation, sometimes it's music, however we choose to dance that day. And I use that time. I set 4 o'clock because I'm a mom, and I started doing it when the kids were little, so I had to do it before they got up, right? And it's just become sacred to me. So now it's just a clock that's internal that I wake up, and that's my time to just be me and God, to work out whatever I need to work out to set my intentions for the day. The self-care part, I am not good at. So I just want to confess that I start out with all kinds of good intentions and, setting Sabbath and et cetera, et cetera. I've been journaling about that a lot now because now I'm 59 and I feel the wear and tear on my body of responding to people and responding to things, responding to situations. And, if in my journal, I say, if I'm completely transparent with myself about myself, that this compelling nature to respond when people call is a form of idolatry. And I'm trying to break myself of that because I am not God. And I'm not required to be God, right? And this pastoral call, especially in Black community where I serve, is often infused, is always infused with patriarchy, but is often infused with patriarchy in a sneaky kind of way, right? This notion that even as a woman who preaches that it's my job to tend to everything, it's my job to care for every pain, it's my job to show up for every crisis. And just the other week, I was literally exhausted and had walked away from my computer to lay down on the sofa because I had nothing left. And someone called and heard in my voice that I was exhausted, right? And said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I'm exhausted." And then they said, "Someone at the hospital needs you." And I got up and I went, It wasn't even somebody at the hospital who I knew, right? And that family needed comfort. But the question is, does it have to be me? That's the mini God piece. And so I confess because, even though all my colleagues on here, they might have it all together, there's somebody who's listening that don't want to say, I really suck at that. And so I'm going to say it out loud that it is the place in my life that I'm committed to. Because what I do know as a pastor is that when someone dies, they walk past your casket and on the way out, they're figuring out who can do what you did.
Who's next? Who got next?
The world does not need me to turn. And so at some point, I have to prioritize myself. And I confess I am not there yet, but it is where I want to be.
I want to say to Richard, who posed this question, to thank you, Richard, for this question, because it is, you qualify it, right? What type of spiritual discipline is conducive having a prophetic voice, right? So that means, and I agree that there are certain ways that those of us, and we all know that Reverend Traci is one of those, right? So is Dr. Barber, persons who have that prophetic voice. And I've come to understand that I do too. And so there is a weight, there is a burden, there is a level of anxiety for me anyway that comes along with that, because it means speaking and preaching and navigating the world in such a way where you are often oppositional. And that's not fun. And you don't get, a lot of warm and fuzzies from people, even congregations, when you have to preach and teach in that kind of way, where you're calling things and people into account. So I just wanted to say that. And so for me, I have learned over the years more of who I am in terms of being an introvert, which means that I get my energy, I refuel by having my alone time, by separating myself. And so I make a practice of that, of having time alone where I can hear myself, where I can listen to myself and listen to the God in me and the divine spirit. So for me, I do that. The place I like to do that is on the beach somewhere, where I hear the water and the waves and go into the water and just be in there and have that time to think and listen and hear. And the other piece of that for me, where I have grown, is that I see my well-being, and I'm using well-being as opposed to self-care, that I see my well-being as connected to other people also, community. So I have sisters where I get held accountable, where I can be my authentic self, where I can be vulnerable and share my struggles and challenges, and they feed me and they nurture me, and I do the same for them. So I have like 3 groups of sister friends that we do that they care for me, my well-being, and I care for them. So those are a couple of things, couple of the ways my brother Richard, that I tend to my well-being, that enables me to continue this prophetic ministry that God has gifted me with.
Amen. Thank you, friends, for the inspiration, the wisdom, being that prophetic voice, and really inviting us and our audience to imagine a way of responding, to really listen, hear, and take seriously the cries of God's people. We are grateful for your contribution, for your workshops that you provided us. Just a couple of very quick things, and then we'll go out. But you'll receive a new set of workshops recordings on Monday, and so you'll have a few days to review those, to write down questions, engage that content. And then we'll meet again this time next Thursday for a new set of panelists and a new keynote speaker. And so we are grateful for your time here. The one last thing that I want to put in the chat is that we are currently accepting and reviewing applications for next year's SENT cohort. That is a year-long commitment that offers all sorts of resourcing, education, peer support. If you are in those early stage of development, or you have an idea for a social enterprise and you would like support in navigating that early stage of development, then we invite you to consider applying, and that application link is in the chat. Thank you all so much. Oh, we see it again. For your time this evening. May we be inspired to go deep, as Bishop Barber said, to find the hope in the depth of the despair. And may we be inspired to respond well and to continue imagining a world where that is heaven on earth, the way that God has called us to. So go in peace tonight.